My name is Viraj. This is Carl. We have Michael over there. And that's it from the founding committee for the Political Economy Forum. Professor Alam is our mentor, and he will be conducting the first teach-in today. So I thought it would be useful to tell you guys why I helped create the Political Economy Forum. I'm going to graduate from Northeastern with a Bachelor of Science degree in economics in 2014. Bachelor of Science degree in economics. Meaning upon graduation, I should have some understanding and have an actual skill set that allows me to practically analyze international economies and world markets. I can strongly say that upon graduation, I will have the ability to, at most, use economic slang to explain a few phenomena, such as how an increase in price will take place amidst a decrease in demand, or how investments will decline amongst a high interest rate. What I do not know is real economics. The only coursework that we are taught here in Northeastern and at many universities around the nation and let alone the world is centered around neoclassical economics, which is the foundation for free market capitalism. Any of the physical sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, they're all based off of proven theorem and tested hypotheses. All variables are accounted for in these physical sciences. If there is a variable that is unaccounted for, then the theorem is not accepted as true. Take Newton's law of gravity. If for some reason one of the assumptions that this law was based on, no one would hold it to be true. Only if the assumptions of a framework are accurate will and should that framework should and will be accepted as true. The model of neoclassical economics that runs the global economy today and plays a prominent role in politics is a framework that is based on the following three assumptions. People have rational preferences, basically saying people are rational, they make rational decisions all the time. Individuals maximize utility and firms maximize profits. People act independently on the basis of full and relevant information, basically saying that all actors in the market always have access to perfect information. With common sense, you can easily identify two of those assumptions to be false. People are rational. With advertising nowadays, it's clearly not true, right? For a simple example. People act independently and always have access to full information. That is also up for debate. So if there are false assumptions behind a theory, behind a science, which is what people regard economics as, then how can we as a society use this model, use the neoclassical model as a benchmark to dictate everything else, everything from who we elect as president to even how we think about the economy as a whole? Aside from these false assumptions, the free market capitalist model does not account for one very, very big variable. A variable so important that it cannot be left out. These models do not take account for power. Economics is a mainstream talking point for politicians and citizens and students in the classroom does not take into account of power. In the real world, power has the ability to change the rules of the game and therefore the way it is played. It is important that we open our minds to a more realistic, holistic, and accurate way of approaching our economy. We need to promote this sort of healthy discussion more often, which is the reason that we have founded this forum. Activist from the late 19th century, H.L. Mencken, said this: "The notion that a radical is one who hates his country is naive and usually idiotic. He is more likely one who likes his country more than the rest of us, and is thus more disturbed than the rest of us when he sees his country debauched. He is not a bad citizen turning to crime, he is a good citizen driven to despair." This is why I am a part of the Political Economy Forum, and I thank you guys for joining.
This forum seeks to foster open-minded and critical debates about real-world economies, not the imaginary and emaciated economies of mainstream texts. Orthodox economics studies economies at rest, We prefer to study economies in motion. Orthodox economics is often rooted in unproven axioms. We want to start from tested propositions. Orthodox economics believes that econometrics is a good substitute for experiments. We know that these tools can torture data until it confesses. Orthodox economics claims scientific validity. We remain wary of ideologies that masquerade as science. Orthodox economics studies disembodied rational men. We seek to study living human beings in all their complexity. Orthodox economics reifies commodities. We see them as complex entities. Orthodox economics takes power, historical time, energy, entropy, ecology out of the economy. What does it mean? We want to bring them right back in. Orthodox economics pretends to be ethically neutral, but imposes its own skewed values on economic discourse. We recognize that no discourse, no economic discourse can be morally neutral. We want to promote alternative discourses that are motivated by an ethics that regards all humans as equally deserving of dignity, rights, and a good life. I'd say that is our manifesto. So the topic of today's teaching is why do we need an alternative discourse about the economy? Alternative to, the discourse, the only discourse to which we are exposed, subjected rather, brainwashed in the economics departments, not only of United States, but because United States is the hegemonic power, anything that United States does is lapped up by the rest of the world. So that's the only discourse that you learn. And your mind is fitted into the narrow box of neoclassical economics, which leaves out, as I just mentioned, virtually everything that matters. And the things that it does include, like human beings, they are not recognizable as human beings. It includes commodities, but those commodities have almost none of the properties of the commodities in the real world. It includes markets, but then defines markets that don't exist. And all of these very heroic assumptions that constructs an unreal imaginary economy then allows them to establish propositions about how perfect this world is that they have created, and then claim that this is how market economies behave. What we have established about perfectly competitive economies is really also true of the real world market economies. So, the first thing to recognize is that there are two kinds of discourses, or two classes of discourses. One is the hegemonic, in the social sciences. There is the hegemonic discourse, the discourse or the understanding of the world, the distorted, partial understanding of the world that rationalizes, that articulates the interests of the powerful classes, the powerful elites. And that is neoclassical economics. That is mainstream economics. That is orthodox economics. Now, there are many other approaches to economics, but you don't hear about it. You are not, certainly you are not exposed to it. And it is, at some later stage, I'm going to list to you all the kinds of economic approaches that already exist. But it is unlikely that you have heard about it. So, and these are the critical discourses that seek to remove the veil that neoclassical economics places over realities, so that you can't see reality as it is. So the first task of any critical inquiry is to understand that no discourse is value-free, bias-free, especially discourses that claim to be value-free. And neoclassical economics claims vigorously, strenuously, that we are scientific. This is a positivist endeavor. We don't incorporate any kinds of normative values. Economics is makes only positive statements about the real world. That's really a lot of nonsense. Indeed, the more laden a discourse is with values, with the values of the powerful elites, the more strenuously it tries to conceal these values and to present these values as facts, to disguise them in technical jargon and mathematical formulae. So the chief aim of the dominant discourse is to conceal the mechanisms by which the powerful elites exercise their power, to hide these mechanisms under false appearances, to create the illusion that the system serves everyone and that it works better than any alternative. So we don't have to consider any alternative. Dina, there is no alternative. That is the underlying assumption behind the mainstream orthodox economic discourse. It is the task of dominant discourse, this hegemonic discourse, to convince its victims that they, not the system, are the true authors of their failures and pain. If you are unemployed, it's because you are lazy. You don't look for a job. It is not because the economy fails, because the economy malfunctions, because the economy breaks down. And it breaks down because of the greed of the powerful. The second task of a critical inquiry that is opposed to the hegemonic discourse is to construct alternative discourses that include all those values that are excluded from the hegemonic discourse. In relation to the economy, these discourses, alternative discourses, must include the interests, the emotions, aesthetics, concerns, fears, anxieties, and joys of real men, women, and children. Not the rational man who is a robot. In fact, in economics, they say economics is a science of choice. But there is no choice to be made. You can predict what choices people will make based on their rational preferences and the fact that they maximize profits and maximize utility. Everything is foretold, everything is predetermined. So what economic theory analyzes is the behavior of robots which have been programmed to behave in a certain way. And then in addition, we need to bring back power, ecology, entropy, and ethics into the economic discourse, and do so transparently. The point is to go back to the comprehensive discourse about the economy that existed some 100 years ago, up to about 100 years ago, before the takeover of the economics discipline by neoclassical economics. And that's why we call this club the political economy focus. That's what economics was called in the time of Adam Smith and before him. And right until the late 19th century. there are still, there's one very prestigious journal of economics, quote unquote prestigious, called the Journal of Political Economy. That's sort of a remnant from the period when economics was comprehensive. It included all aspects of social reality. There aren't too many people here who have taken a course with me. How many? Okay, a few. Now those who have taken a course with me know Mullah Nasruddin, right?
Yes.
Mullah Nasruddin is a sage, a person of wit, and a person with puckish humor. And there are many stories that circulate about Mullah Nasruddin in which he is the central character, and he plays some tricks upon you, tricks which reveal your biases, your prejudices, the limitations of your mind, and the ways in which your biases interfere with your ability to see the world as it is, which involves you in contradictions, in double standards. So there's one particular story that I tell to every one of my classes. In this particular story, Mullah Nasruddin goes to one of his neighbors and asks if he can borrow a cooking pot. He's having a feast, and he's going to need a big cooking pot. His neighbor lends him the cooking pot. And when Mullah Nasruddin, a week later, goes to return the cooking pot to his neighbor, he places a smaller cooking pot in the larger cooking pot. His neighbor notices the smaller cooking pot and reminds Mullah Nasruddin that he had lent him only one large cooking pot. He says, yeah, that's true, but while your cooking pot was with me, it gave birth to a baby. His neighbor, did not object to that. It didn't strike him as odd or absurd or impossible. Why should he? He has gained a cooking pot. Right? An extra cooking pot. So Mullah Nasruddin goes back to this neighbor and asks if he can borrow the big cooking pot again. His neighbor is more than happy to lend it to him in the expectation that he will get another baby pot. So this time the Mullah neighbor goes back to his neighbor to return the cooking pot. So weeks pass, and then the neighbor comes to Mullah Nasruddin and says, I need that cooking pot. Can I have it back? The Mullah, with a very sad face, tells him, I'm terribly sorry. See, I would love to return the cooking pot to you, but it died. And I buried it in my backyard. I can show you where it is buried. His friend, his neighbor thought are you joking, Mullah? Is this one of your tricks? Are you pulling my leg? Mullah, with a very serious face, says, no, I'm quite serious. And then, his neighbor starts getting angry and almost is on the point of becoming violent when Mullah Nasruddin says, just hold on. Didn't your cooking pot give birth to a baby? So if it can give birth to a baby, why can't it die? See how your interests, these are stories which can be interpreted in many different ways at many different levels. But, I tell these stories to point to the prejudices, the biases that are embodied in social sciences. Social sciences are chock full of the values who have created the social sciences. The most pervasive bias in the social sciences is the Eurocentric bias. Since social sciences, most of it, were created by a few Western nations, everything they write places Europe at the center of history, of world history. And all other civilizations acquire their knowledge, their sciences, their values, their institutions from the West, from Europe. So there are nationalistic biases. There are class biases, capitalist biases. And in economics, the biases that you will encounter if you look carefully are the biases of a particular class on the one hand, and the biases of the powerful nations. By bias, you can replace bias with interest, the economic interest, or the cultural interest, or the strategic interest. And they're very carefully melded into the discourse, so that it appears to you as natural. That is the most natural way to look at the world. So, the question that the Mullah Nasruddin story raises is, do our biases affect the outcome of our study of the economy? Let's say, even broader question, do our biases affect the way in which we look at natural phenomena, physical phenomena, biological phenomena, and social phenomena? Well, there is no reason why it should not. And I will explain that in a minute with some very simple examples. But yet, the natural sciences, physical sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, is protected, shielded to a much greater degree from our biases than the social sciences are. And we will look at the reason for that. That's something that no course in economics, almost no professor in economics will ever examine. And that is the methodology of economics. How do economists study the economy? What is the method they adopt? Is that, they assume that the method that neoclassical economics adopts to study the economy is the only method, is the scientific method. And therefore, what is there to study? You see? Everyone accepts science, the scientific method, as the only valid method of studying reality. And so we use the scientific method. Now here's something to ponder. I talked about the hegemonic discourse, which really starts with a classical economist, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Alfred Marshall, and then the marginal utility economists, Menger, Walras, and then in the 50s, the economists who placed the final capstone on the structure of neoclassical economics, the general equilibrium theory. And this is the work of economists who are considered to be gods: Samuelson, Kenneth Arrow, Gerard de Brugge. They established the conditions under which Adam Smith's invisible hand is able to perform its magical job, producing efficient outcomes in the economy without anyone having to worry about reducing these outcomes. And so they established the exact conditions under which the invisible hand is effective. That means the economy produces efficient outcomes. And economists define efficiency in a very peculiar manner. See? But again, that's the only definition of efficiency that you will encounter, and therefore you accept it as the only way of looking at efficiencies. So what are the alternative discourses? Let me just rattle off a number of alternative economic schools of thought, starting with the mercantilists, the physiocrats, the classical economists, Ricardian economics, German historical school, American institutionalism, neoclassical economics, Austrian economics, Keynesianism, neo-Keynesianism, structural development economics, neo-Marxist economics, neo-institutionalist, neo-Ricardian economics, feminist economics, thermoeconomics, ecological economics, social economics, Gassellian economics, bioeconomics, Islamic economics, Buddhist economics, Gandhian economics, behaviorist economics, neuroeconomics. And this is not I would add a few more. When you go to study physics, theory, the behavior of heat, do you encounter 15 different theories of how heat behaves, how heat is transferred from one body to another? Really, one theory. When you want to study the motion of a physical object, a stone thrown on the earth, or the trajectory of a rocket, or even the path of the planets in the solar system, are there many theories? There's only one theory. All of this is explained by Newton's laws of motion. When you want to explain why an object falls to the earth, you have one very simple theory, the theory of gravity, that Galileo discovered. So here is a profound difference. Neoclassical economics argues that we are a scientific discipline. We are just like physics. And in fact, if you pick up a journal of economics today, you will, and you look at it from a distance, it is no different from a journal of physics. It is as mathematical. So they imitate the language of physics. Superficially, they imitate physics. But when you study the physical world, when you study a stone is a stone. No matter where you take it, its properties don't change. A stone has mass, and that mass can be defined exactly. That's not true of economic phenomena or economic entities. That's not true of us as human beings, us as consumers, us as workers, as investors. We are complex entities, and a stone or a planet or a galaxy does not have a mind. We have a mind, we have a will of our own. If you kick me out of this room, you can't predict which way I will go. What emotions will propel me? What thoughts, emotions, anger, vengeance, grief, insult. We are not like a piece of stone. But economics, the neoclassical economics, reduces us to robots, to a piece of stone, so that then it can predict exactly how we will behave. But we don't behave like that. So why are there so many different approaches to the study of economics? And yet, despite this multiplicity of approaches, there is one and only one economics that you learn about. Isn't this strange? I mean, at the least, if they are going to focus only on neoclassical economics, then in some course, they have to systematically reject every other approach to economics as inferior. Right? Only then you can concentrate on neoclassical economics. But they do none of that. They don't even mention that there are other kinds of economics. The implicit assumption is, and sometimes economists will argue, that this is because neoclassical economics follows the scientific method. It is a science like physics. And they will claim, incorrectly, that all our theories have been tested. That is totally wrong. Take the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage. It was first presented in 1850. This theory was not even tested until 130 years later. So without being tested, this theory was embraced as the only theory that explains trade. And that theory tells us that free trade is the best policy, and so free trade is the best policy. Britain accepts free trade as the best policy, and Britain is the hegemonic power, and therefore it tries to impose this on every other nation, but no nation that is sovereign accepts this garbage. Except those who are colonies. They are forced to accept free trade because they are colonies. They don't have their own governments. So you can claim that, and neoclassical economics, or has the appearance of being a science, and I'll show that in a minute. And another way of sort of implicit way of arguing is that, hey, listen, why should we waste time studying any other approach to economics? All the top universities in the world, not just the top universities, virtually every economics department in the United States, with maybe a few exceptions, uses this economics. So the smart people are using neoclassical economics. Why? This proves that it is superior. It's as if you use force, physical force, power, to eliminate options. Not argument, not reasoning, not testing, not experiments, but you use power to eliminate all other options, all other approaches, and then you claim this one that survives, it survives because it was superior. No, it was backed by superior power, superior force of the powerful classes. And all the other approaches were never given a chance. So let me use an example, to consider the conflict between truth and bias, truth and interest. Most people contain two tendencies. We all have some interest in discovering the truth about things. Truth about nature, truth about society, truth about nations, truth about how markets work. Right? But we also have interests. We also have interests. We have material interests, economic interests, political interests, cultural interests. And I'm here speaking of you as individuals. So on the one hand, you want to know the truth, but if the truth that you discover about something is opposed to any of your interests, do you like that truth? You suppress it, consciously or unconsciously. If you have power, you suppress it by force. And that same thing happens at the collective level, at the level of nations, at the level of the worlds. That is, those truths which oppose the interests of the most powerful people, their economic interests, material interests, cultural interests, ethnic interests, they suppress it. This is so obvious, isn't it? This is so obvious that truth and interest can collide. And when they will collide, then the powerful interest will suppress the truth. And so neoclassical economics is the economics that emerges after it has suppressed those aspects of truth, those aspects of economic reality that would challenge the hegemony, the power of the capitalist classes, of the corporate classes, of the powerful nations. So isn't it obvious? There are so many theories that I just listed. So which one of these theories will prevail? You might say that, okay, the theories that prevail in physics are the ones that make the most accurate predictions about nature, about reality, about the phenomena that they study. So we can do the same thing with economics. But economics is not like physics. The social world, the market, the economy is not like physical phenomena. It is infinitely more complex. And as a result, you cannot perform experiments. Now let's examine a more concrete example. Let's say there are two classes in a society, the workers and capitalists. The workers have nothing but their labor to sell, and the capitalists own capital, and therefore they can employ people. They produce things to sell on the market for a profit, and therefore they will employ labor. So now suppose that there are two discourses about the relationship between workers and capitalists. One discourse says that workers produce all value, all economic value. It's the product of labor. But some proportion of this output that labor produces is appropriated by the capitalists in the form of profits, interest, rent, and state subsidies. This is exploitation. This is the Marxist interpretation of the relationship between workers and capitalists. Actually, this was implicitly also the interpretation of the classical economists. All that Marx did was take classical economists and derive from it an implication that was crying out to be known. Because the classical economists, they say that all value is produced by labor. All value is produced by labor. And by the way, I read to my class, I found a small book of quotes from Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln makes the most crystalline statement of the labor theory of value. If he were to do it today, my God, he would be shot for being communist. And then there is the other story that describes the relationship between workers and capital. It says the workers are free. They enter the market as free agents, the labor market as free agents. They are free to sell their labor or not to sell their labor. And so they enter the labor market as free agents and as equals of their prospective employers. So how can there be exploitation? This is a freely undertaken exchange, voluntarily undertaken exchange. No one voluntarily enters into an exchange in which you are going to be exploited, right? That's the story neoclassical economics tells you. Neoclassical economics fundamentally tells you that every exchange that takes place in the market, it takes place in, where the participants engage in that transaction freely. So how can anyone be exploited? So when trade takes place between the United States and Bangladesh, they trade freely, right? No one is forcing anyone to trade with each other. So how can anyone be exploited? There can't be any exploitation in the market because all exchanges in the market are undertaken freely. It looks very convincing, right? But that is the task of the critical discourse, isn't it? To rip this apart, because this is talk only about appearances. So the economists claim that, okay, we have actually subjected all these theories to testing. And neoclassical economics has come out superior. Now, very briefly, let me tell you what scientific method consists of. It consists of it goes through 5 steps. First, you make observation about the reality about which you want to say something. Next, you are, on the basis of that the observation, you arrive at some generalizations. This is called inductive reasoning. Okay. Inductive reasoning is not foolproof. It is, if I make the statement that all swans in Australia are white, that is true only as long as I don't see a black swan. The moment I see a black swan, that inductive result is wrong. So inductive reasoning produces results that are tentative until it is contradicted. So observations, then you arrive at, through inductive reasoning, at postulates. And then these postulates become the basis of a theory. And then you use these theories to make predictions about phenomena that you haven't observed. You observe, you use those observations to derive postulates, build a theory on the basis of those postulates, then use the theory to make predictions about yet unobserved phenomena. And that is where the real test of the theory comes out. It makes these predictions, and then you go out and test it. This is the most crucial part of a scientific discipline. There can be no science unless there is an objective, impersonal way of testing your predictions, the predictions of your theory. And what is that objective instrument, impersonal instrument, which can be repeated by anyone, anywhere? Experiments. Experiment is controlled observation. The theory says X, an increase in X will increase Y. But Y is going to be affected by a million other things. So you have to do an experiment which controls for all those other things. And then you can isolate the impact of the change in X on change in Y. That is an experiment. Now physicists can do that experiment. Chemists can do that experiment. In biology too, on many questions we can do those experiments. In astronomy we can do those experiments. And therefore, you don't find the multiplicity of theories, the controversy. You don't find absurd theories in physics. They did exist at one time, but they have all been rejected. And you don't even have to study those theories except out of historical curiosities. You know, for instance, for nearly 2,000 years, there was a theory of vision. How did we see things? And this theory came from Aristotle. Aristotle says we see things because a light emanates from our eye, from our pupil. It hits an object, and then it comes back to the eye and defines that object for us. And so this theory of vision dominated thinking in Western Europe, Eastern and Western Europe, and the Muslim world for nearly about 1,000 years. And then in the 11th century, a Muslim scientist by the name of Ibn al-Haytham gave you the theory that you know today. See? Now, we don't see things because a ray emanates from the eye. The ray of light comes from a bright object. It hits an object and then is reflected from it, enters our eye, and then imprints its image over there. So, and Ibn al-Haytham did experiments to prove that. And in fact, he invented what is known as the camera obscura, basically the camera. Now, we can't do experiments. We can't test them. The most decisive, clear, objective, impersonal way of testing theories is experiment. And if you don't have experiments, then you open up that inquiry to manipulation by powerful forces, to ideological manipulation. Now, economists, you can tell me that, okay, we can't do experiments, but we do have econometrics. It's statistically, we are able to control for the variables and isolate the impact of one variable on another. You know, when you estimate an equation, it's a growth equation, which says the growth of the GDP depends upon the rate of investment, the level of income, and 50 other variables. But let's say you want to focus on two variables. The growth of income depends upon the rate of investment, but it also depends upon many other variables. Now, you can't do experiments across the world. You take the 150 or 200 countries in the world and say, okay, why don't you guys just double the rate of investment next year? And we want to see how it will affect the growth rate. Because over a short period of time, most of those other variables are unlikely to change. So you can't do that. So we simply have to, econometrics takes the observations that are generated by economies when everything is changing. So you don't have a controlled experiment. Everything is changing. And then statistically, you try to control for these things. But this is a very hazardous, econometrics is a very hazardous exercise. Let me just list to you all the ways. If you, for instance, want to test whether capital punishment reduces the death rate. It looks like so simple, right? Whether capital punishment reduces the death rate. You have data, and you can use econometrics to control for all those other variables. But there is no unanimity. Economists have done all kinds of estimations to try to establish a connection. Some argue that it will be a deterrent, some argue that it won't. And both hypotheses are supported. Or not, both hypotheses are supported. That is because you can do your econometrics, you can choose to do your econometrics to produce the right results. I don't want to go into the details. There are endless number of ways in which you can define your estimating equation. There are different ways in which you define your variables. You can choose different samples on which you test your equation, estimate your equation. You can take the information about murder rates from any one of the states in this country or other countries, from the 50s, from the 70s, from the 90s. And every time you use a different sample, you get a different result. If econometrics had been a good substitute, then in fact, economics had a chance, at least a good chance, of becoming a scientific discipline. But econometrics is of very little help. And as one, Ronald Coase, a very famous economist, who famously said that you can torture the data with econometrics until it confesses. I think we need an international convention to make it illegal for economists to torture data.
Be part of the UN Charter.
Yes, we really need that. There's another problem with economics. I explained to you the way in which scientific and the scientific enterprise proceeds. Observations, postulates based upon observations. So already the postulates are the result of inductive reasoning. Economists don't go through that. Economists engage in some introspection, and then their theories are axiomatic theories, like mathematics, geometry. Geometry starts with the definition of a point and a line, and then constructs a whole system of geometry, Euclidean geometry. Economics is just like Euclidean geometry. You make the assumptions about preferences. You assume that more is better than less. You assume that more choices are better than fewer choices. You assume that individuals have transitive tastes. If they prefer A to B and B to C, then they will prefer A to C. You assume that people are selfish. Do you know that there is a whole new branch of economics that is now emerging and challenging neoclassical economics called behavioral economics? They conduct experiments, psychological experiments, and they have shown that every one of these assumptions are wrong. They simply don't hold up. And this has some amazing implications. In fact, there are a whole bunch of economists who say, why do we need to make realistic assumptions? Let us make whatever assumptions we need to make and build theory on those assumptions. And if their predictions can be tested and shown to be right, then those theories are useful. Now, this is very clever, because they know that in economics theories cannot be tested. And since we have the control, we have the power, no theories are going to be tested, least of all our theories, but we will be able to muscle in and establish our theories, see? And with the right results. Markets are efficient. Free trade is good. In fact, some of them, there's a branch of neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics too has sub-schools. And there's one rational expectations school of neoclassical economics, which says there is no unemployment. There is no unemployment. The people who appear to be unemployed are voluntarily unemployed. Do you know that? And the person who believes in there are several economists who believe in this. One of them received a Nobel Prize, Robert Lucas. There is no unemployment. They are unemployed by choice. So the 20% people in Spain who are unemployed, and the 30% in Greece who are unemployed, and the 9% or 8% in the United States, they're not unemployed. They're just lazy bums. They don't want to work. And they don't want to work because they can mooch on the rest of us, right? I mean, 47%. See, if you take this approach that you can make whatever assumptions and then test the prediction with the theory, but those theories cannot be tested because there is no good way of testing it. You can use econometrics, twist it, kick it, push it, shove it, until it produces the right result. Right? So there's a very simple way of describing this economics. Garbage in, garbage out. It reminds me of Bill O'Reilly, who proved God, who proved that God exists. Tied in, tied out. Have you heard that? There has to be a God because you see this regularity, tied in, tied out. I mean, he has to be the most profound philosopher. See, in one sentence, he has proved the existence of God. Tied in, tied out. That's the kind of clowns that are washed by, he has a larger following than all other networks. How is that possible in the world's greatest country? So here, let me just, let me just itemize some of the problems with economics. I've already given you the fundamental problem. Failure to predict. Right? Take two chunks of economic theory, which are really almost the centerpieces of economics. One is the theory of trade, the neoclassical theory of trade. The neoclassical theory of trade predicts, one, that free trade is the best policy for every country. Not only for the United States or for the rich countries. No, it's the best policy for trade amongst all countries, between the rich and the poor and the poor, the rich, and so on and so on. Okay, so if this were true, then the countries that traded freely should have been the most advanced. The countries that traded freely between 1800 and 1950 should be the most advanced. And the countries that were most protectionist should be the most backward. So which countries between 1800 and 1950 traded freely? The colonies. The colonies in Africa and Asia. They were not allowed to impose even a 2% tariff. And if they were, India had to impose a 2% tariff. The English government in India did it because they needed some revenues. So what they did, they imposed a countervailing tax on production, domestic production, so that the protection of the tariff would be neutralized by the tax on output. They were the most freely trading countries for about 150 to 200 years. They experienced impoverishment, decline in literacy. Their economy, they lost manufacturers. They lost their skills. They lost their cities. They lost the arts of governance. And they stayed poor. And the countries that were most protectionist, the United States was the most protectionist country between 1800 and 1950. You can check all these things. The most protectionist country. And it became the richest country. The mythology is that Great Britain became the leader of the leading economy in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century because it practiced free trade. Absolute hogwash. And the amazing thing is that you can go to any neoclassical economics across this country. You can go to Harvard or MIT or any place. Ask those economists, was Britain a free trading country? And is that why it became rich? They'll say yes. How? That is completely wrong. Britain was, from 16th century to the middle of the 19th century, the most protectionist country. It followed mercantilist policies. the state intervened in the economy in every conceivable ways. They had a Navigation Act which forced all trade between Britain and other countries to be carried in British bottoms. They placed a ban on the export of skilled British labor and machinery. They not imposed tariffs, they prohibited the import of Indian textiles into Britain. They simply couldn't compete. The most massive protection you can imagine, and intervention. And of course, they waged wars to gain colonies, to open up markets, to get cheap raw materials. Isn't wars intervention? So how is it? Just take the theory of trade. Then there is another part of the theory of trade which says that if two nations trade freely, then their wages will become equal. Right? You can just take the last 50 years, Europe and United States have been trading freely. Have their wages become equal? Then take the trade between the colonies were trading freely with Britain, with France, with Germany, with the United States. Did their wages become equal, or did they go like this? So there you can see these are not theories. There is no scientific content to these theories. In fact, the truth is you don't need econometrics to test many of these theories. You can just look at the raw data. The raw data is absolutely convincing, overwhelmingly convincing. But you see, if you are an ideology, you are not going to be overthrown by evidence, because ideology is entrenched by means of power. So, well, let's look at the other centerpiece, the glory of neoclassical economics, the theory of growth, the neoclassical theory of growth, Solo's model. What does that say? It makes a whole bunch of assumptions. And then it says, in this model, growth will always occur, but not endlessly. See, every economy will grow for a period of time, and then they will all converge to the same level of per capita income. So this should have happened 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. Every country should have been at the same level of per capita income. And especially in the last 200 years, we would have expected, if Britain moved ahead, that everyone else should have converged to the level of Britain in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. This theory doesn't say how long it will take. Basically, it says it will take a few years. So again, you take the centerpiece of neoclassical theory, and then, okay, so this theory, eventually after about 30 years, they say, okay, this theory really doesn't work, so let's come up with another theory. They come up with a theory which they call the endogenous growth theory. They say that, the rich countries actually are able to grow faster because they have greater knowledge base, and the greater your knowledge base, the more innovation you can undertake. And that's why they always have the edge. Now, if that is true, then why didn't this operate in the 11th century or 5,000 years ago? And actually, from up until 1800, virtually every economy of the world had the same level of standard of living. They consumed the same amount of calories. This is the most extraordinary fact, that per capita income remained constant virtually across the world, across countries, up until 1800. And then for some countries, it went like this. Neoclassical economics cannot explain that. Classical economics can. Because neoclassical economics simply does not incorporate energy. See, there was a change in the energy paradigm around 1800. We moved, before 1800, we got all our energy. The economy got its energy from plants, and therefore from land. And because land was fixed, we could get only so much energy. After 1800, we got our coal, energy from coal, from oil, from under the ground. And unlimited amounts of it, at least for a short period of time. Neoclassical economics simply does not recognize these things, because for neoclassical economics, energy is just like any other intermediate input. It's like steel and cement and sulfuric acid and glass. Energy is what, the economy is a manifestation of energy. The economy consists of activities. What is action in physics? In physics, if you want to change the state of rest or motion of a body, you need force. You need to apply force to it. Force is energy. So the economy is a manifestation of energy, and to talk about the economy without talking about energy is absurd. And it leads to a lot of problems. I know that we are, how much time do I have?
Wait, 2 minutes?
2 minutes? Okay. Well, okay, I will make my own interpretation of 2 minutes. You see, with regard to trade, Adam Smith had asked the right question initially, in his very first chapter. What he asked, he examined the relationship between markets, size of markets, and division of labor. Division of labor is what generates growth. It was a dynamic question. Does opening up of an economy to the markets of the world, it widens the market, and therefore it leads to greater division of labor, and therefore there will be more growth. Of course, what he did not take into account is that if two countries are open to trade, one of them gains an advantage in the increasing returns industries, then it will continue to grow. So what did Ricardo do? Ricardo changed the question. He says, let's take an economy with fixed amount of capital, fixed amount of labor, fixed technology, and ask, if we open up this economy, will it gain? And very simply, yes, it will gain. But this is a trivial question. We are not interested in finding out what trade does when in an economy with fixed amount of resources. We want to find out what trade does to technological change, indigenous technological capability, indigenous entrepreneurship, indigenous capital, indigenous sovereignty, freedom. But none of those questions. You just brush those questions by framing the question in a way that you get the right answer. The framing is everything in politics and in economics. The way you frame your question, you will get the right answer. The Republican Party hates taxes, right? And therefore, when they don't talk about tax cuts. They talk about tax relief. Why do you think they talk about tax relief? You get relief from pain. Tax is a pain. It is a disease. So we will give you relief. So by framing this question, this whole phenomenon as relief, tax relief, you are telling people that tax is pain. You don't have to prove anything. Tax is pain. I'll just, there's one last point that I will make, which really I think completely knocks the bottom out of neoclassical economics. The point that neoclassical economics makes with great pride is that it is scientific. It makes, in your principles of microeconomics, you have a discussion on positive statements and normative statements, right? And economics is about positive statements. We make positive statements like people maximize utility, people are rational, people have transitive preferences, producers maximize profits. These are supposedly positive statements. Are they? The behavioral economists, by means of experiments, psychological experiments, have shown that this is not true. It is not even true that we are selfish. You can read the literature. You can pick up a textbook on behavioral economics. And behavioral economics is gaining slowly. So what the neoclassical economists were claiming are positive statements like people are rational, people maximize utility. No, those are normative statements. You want people to be rational. You want people to have transitive preferences. You want people to prefer more to less. Those are normative statements. Those are not, if they were positive statements, then they would be borne out by experiments. So in this case, people are able to do experiments, actual experiments, because you're doing experiments with individuals. These are hypotheses you make about individuals, so you can do experiments. Psychologists do experiments all the time. So where does neoclassical economics stand, you see? When you absolutely have knocked out the bottom, all the statements that you claim were positive are actually normative. See, the neoclassical economics has been under attack from so many different alternative approaches which are far more convincing, have greater explanatory power. I can give you theories which will explain why the world has diverged. I will give you theories which will say why free trade is bad for the weaker, poorer country, which will explain it. But you are not going to be taught that theory. Those theories are available. They are superior theories. They have greater predictive power. But you are not going to be taught those theories because it is not, this is not science. This is ideology. This supports the interests of the United States and Britain and the European Union and Japan. And they impose it through the World Bank, through IMF, by forcing countries, literally forcing countries to accept loans. Do you know that? That the US aid uses subterfuge and trickery to force third world countries to take loans. Because then you burden them with loans they can't repay, and then you can come and start twisting their arms. You see? Okay, we will reschedule this loan if you privatize your industries, if you open up your economy. Actually, one of the consultants for the US aid, what's his name?
John Perkins.
Now, John Perkins has written a book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And you know, I didn't have to read John Perkins. I know this to be a fact. This is an ancient practice. The rich lend money to the poor. The landlord lends money to the farmer. The owner of the factory kiln lends money to his workers. And then once they become indebted, then they become debt slaves. So the third world, since the 1980s, they were converted into debt slaves. And once they became debt slaves, then the IMF and World Bank could come and force them to dismantle their development policies. Impose free trade, to privatize their industries so that they could be sold at dirt cheap prices to foreign corporations, to open up their exchange market so that their stock markets and currency could be manipulated by a few people sitting in Wall Street and who could then reap billions of dollars in profits. Just one more minute. I will finish by reading a poem also. You know, I let that young girl read that poem. This is a poem from Jalaluddin Rumi, a 13th century Iranian mystic. Actually, he's the most widely read poet in the United States. He wrote in Persian. He was deeply steeped in the wisdom of the Quran, and yet Americans read him. It's called Dervish at the Door. A dervish is a monk, a wandering monk. It says a dervish knocked at a house to ask for a piece of dry bread, or moist, it didn't matter. And the owner of the house says, "This is not a bakery. Might you have a piece of gristle then? Does this look like a butcher shop? A little flour? Do you hear a grinding stone? Some water? This is not a well." Do you know who says these things? You are talking, you know, this guy who's come to ask, he's the moocher. Why don't you work? Why don't you take responsibility for yourself? See how relevant this poem is. Whatever the dervish asked for, the man made some tired joke and refused to give him anything. Finally, the dervish ran into the house, lifted his robe and squatted as though to take shit. The owner of the house starts bawling, shouting, "Quiet, you sad man. A deserted place is a fine spot to relieve oneself. And since there's no living thing here, or means of living, it needs fertilizing." The The dervish then began his own list of questions and answers. What kind of a bird are you? Actually, the translation should have been, what kind of a fowl are you? Not a falcon trained for a royal hand, not a peacock painted with everyone's eyes, not a parrot that talks for sugar cubes, not a nightingale that sings like someone in love, not a hoopoe bringing messages to Solomon, or a stork that builds on a cliffside. What exactly do you do? You are no known species. You have forgotten. You keep everything to yourself. You have forgotten the one who doesn't care about ownership and who doesn't try to turn a profit from every human exchange. Which system does that? The system in which we live, which tries to turn a profit from every human exchange. See, that's called commodification. Turn everything into a commodity so that you can make profit from it. Commoditize water, commoditize childcare, commoditize love, commoditize body parts, organs, commoditize the mountains, the rivers, so that some corporation can come, take ownership, and sell it to you, and make profit, privatize everything. That's called commodification. And capitalism is an endless process of commodification. That's all I have to tell you.